I don't know if we've had a speaker who has a more diverse and interdisciplinary background than our speaker today. She is a dynamo. Formally, she leads strategy, government relations, and a whole slew of other things I'll let her reveal to you at an incredible startup called Our Next Energy. She has been on that team since its founding. She just informed me, actually, and it blew my mind. She hired employees 15 through 60 of that company. She also spearheaded their search for a new North American battery factory that was announced last month for a $1.6 billion investment they're making to build right here in Southeast Michigan. She's also conducted large policy evaluations for the New York City Department of Education. She founded and ran her own startup within that realm that she'll talk about as well. And she's pretty damn qualified to do all that because she got a PhD in neuroscience and nutrition from Columbia, an MPH and another master's in policy from Tufts. And before all that, where did she go? That's right. That's right. She went to U of M. She went here, and she was a student majoring in biology as well as another specialty or two. But she made her way up to North Campus because she was intrigued by the solar car team. And she led the development of the world-renowned battery pack that they used at the time. She also led out a student organization that led humanitarian medical missions to Guatemala. And she has most recently been named, as it would naturally follow, one of the top leaders in the electric vehicle industry in the world. So, please help me welcome Deeana Ahmed.
Hi everyone, how's everyone doing? It's always really great to be back on campus. I have to remind myself that I'm not a student because I start to wonder if my homework is due as soon as I start to walk into these halls. So really excited to talk to you about my entrepreneurial journey and interdisciplinary career, and a little bit about a battery company called Our Next Energy that's headquartered here in Michigan, and the windy road that I and many others on that journey took to arrive at this place. So I really like this framework of talking about a career around trying, risking, failing, and then doing. So when we think about trying, I think trying is a way in which to capture and encapsulate the breadth of your experiences. And I think experiences can be defined in so many different ways. It's not just the formal experiences that we're given credit, degrees for, or bullet points on our resumes. Sometimes it's the softer experiences. It's the things that move us and kind of point us in a direction with momentum, and that momentum is what can help to build towards the future capabilities, particularly as an entrepreneur. So when I think about my personal journey and the things that I've tried a whole slew of professions and roles and disciplines and subjects. So starting here at U of M, I majored in biology and South Asian studies. I was a pre-med student and was really kind of focused on medicine, I think because of my lack of understanding of the breadth of opportunities that were out there. So in growing up here in Michigan, without my parents, my mom having immigrated from Tanzania and not having kind of very formal exposure to the breadth of diversity of education opportunities, it was really like doctor, lawyer, or engineer in terms of when I arrived here, what was I going to do? And went through kind of exactly those three prospective opportunities. And medicine was really interesting to me because of impact. And when I was growing up in particular, when we thought about medicine and doctors, it was like people who help people. And so that opportunity for impact was something that really drove my interest in pursuing a pre-med undergrad, which is hard, and I'm sure maybe there's people in the crowd here who are going through that here at U of M, particularly hard here. But then I stumbled upon something called public health. And as Eric mentioned, I was a member of the solar car team here at U of M, which was maybe my first opportunity in being able to say, okay, I'm studying this, but I'm also going to look at this other space and participate and learn actively, even if I wasn't formally an engineering student. But in discovering public health and doing medical mission work to Guatemala, it was really at the time when we didn't talk about the risks of sugar consumption. It was like the rethink your drink and Michelle Obama's whole movement around exercise and nutrition, especially for young people. And I started to think about, if we want to have impact on people, we probably have to think upstream. And I think this was like my first foray in thinking about systems, because there's a lot of systems at play that can contribute to the way in which people were sick, and then you're triaging as a physician. But when you're thinking upstream, you start to look at all of the systems that can impact people. And then, public health actually being so broad around impact, and not just around the physical health, but so many other parts of health, that motivated a diversion. And it was like kind of my first left turn on what I thought was going to be a very linear career. And in doing that, in stepping into public health, I pursued a master's of public health and an MS in food policy at Tufts. I started to become exposed to a component of the system, which was policy, and looking at, thinking about the impact of food and nutrition on young people in particular. We have all of these food service programs in the United States that are federally managed. We have a school breakfast program, a summer food service program, and a school lunch program. And I started my first job, and my first role was around administrating a nutrition program in the state of Massachusetts. Fast forward to being exposed to local, state, and federal policy. That was kind of my first intersection with kind of the policy component, but then also in grad school, conducting research. And when you're sitting in a research and policy setting, you're starting to see that, okay, when we look at these systems, maybe we can start to have impact because we learn things in research. So we know sugar is not great to eat in excess for young people in particular, and we can apply it to policy. So how do we change federal food programs? And then that was kind of the first exposure to the incredibly challenging uphill battle that is required in order to make policy changes like that. So spent something like 6 months trying to get another vegetable added to the school lunch program, which was ultimately unsuccessful. And then I was like, okay, back to the drawing board. How do we really have impact on people? So finishing that work, I had been spending a couple of years teaching, because that's another opportunity for impact. You can teach young people, and as a science student, spend a lot of time teaching young people. In high school, different science classes, math classes, and then started to shape college admissions journeys. And that was a really unique insight into a practice opportunity. And through that experience was born my first Risk, which was my first startup, Ivy Admissions. And so Ivy Admissions is an admissions consulting firm that's headquartered in Silicon Valley. It is a bootstrapped business that I started from scratch with a co-founder and really kind of took every incremental step to bring an additional client to the door. But in this work, I was still always thinking about impact and then the systems that we had at play. And when we look at young people trying to get into university, and I'm sure many can resonate here in this room, there is a need to be able to demonstrate your development over a 4-year period and convey that in a compelling way in a written format, and highlight skills, and then demonstrate how are you actually going to have an impact on the university that you're going to go to, and how are you going to be able to leverage the learnings that you have in that setting to go forward in your career. And so this work became kind of my first Risk, in that it was incredibly grueling. And in this experience is really where I learned, grit and like the resilience of sales, and how as a co-founder of something absolutely brand new, you have to be the person who is on the phone with parents or on the phone with your customers, bringing them to the table. You have to oversee the entire customer experience. You have to start learning what your customer funnel is, how to target your prospective customers and bring people to the table, how to reinvest the money that you're making into growing the business. Learned about communication and the importance of having really professional, consistent, rapid, and thorough communication with the people that you are working to grow your business from. So in my case, clientele. And then, learned a lot about business operations and strategy. And in business operations, I had none of that background from my, undergrad experience. But in this risk that I took, it was really the first opportunity to realize that we can actually be lifelong students, that in not knowing something, if you have the confidence that you can figure it out, you can leverage resources and supports and community. And I came from a community of people who were entrepreneurially minded that allowed me to have the right insights to understand how to run and scale and grow a business. Have generated over several millions of dollars of revenue for this company, have over 30 employees kind of working to run with students right now. But with this risk, I also experienced a little bit of a failure, and I think the framing of the failure is really a personal introspective failure, in that I started to realize that the work that I was doing wasn't fulfilling the impact drive that I had. And in working one-on-one with students and managing a process, that was great, phenomenal impact, and I saw so many kids achieve their dreams through this process, and got to do a lot of pro bono work as well, which was really gratifying. But in that failure moment, I realized, I had developed and cultivated entrepreneurial skills because I took something from nothing and grew it, and that really is kind of the grit of what it takes to be an entrepreneur. But that I wanted to revert back to the health of young people, and so I decided to pursue my PhD. And so, scaling this business and continuing to scale this business while I was doing my PhD was hard. And so I started to kind of ratchet down my impact and focus on the business and focus on, okay, now in thinking about that triad, which I didn't articulate previously, of research, policy, and practice. I had exposure into research. I had spent a lot of time in policy, and I had started to experience practice through my entrepreneurship work and my business. But I wanted to see how I could invest more time into research to try to drive impact across that triad, where I really was starting to think about, how do you take evidence-based findings and then translate that into impact through policy, and then also through impact with practice and business and entrepreneurship. And so the pursuit of a PhD was really with the vision of wanting to figure out a nutrition or food-based or public health solution for young people. I have a theory that our nutrition is pretty critical during early childhood development, and measuring that is very complicated. So I studied early childhood brain function and the impacts on early childhood brain function as measured by 4 brain waves with respect to early childhood feeding behaviors. And you spend several years in a PhD to amass a tiny little mountain of findings where you're like, okay, I've derived some insights. And my insights were exciting, and it kind of was motivating me towards this idea that, okay, we can take insights like this and start to impact policy. Like, for example, early childhood food policy, and let's try to bring more supports in that time frame to help mitigate some of the downstream effects on health in the future, but then also a business opportunity, and that there are people who are looking to prioritize health and make sure that they are doing the best for their children, and so there is an opportunity to bring something to market. But all during this time, I was also learning how to be an effective program manager, and that during my PhD, while running my business, living in Manhattan, I had my daughter, Isra. She is now almost 3 years old. She is pretty brilliant, and this was 2 months prior to the pandemic. So the pandemic hits, doing this work, kind of still working on my PhD, and I'm trying to figure out how to fully fire myself from Ivy. And really, all of that led to one. And so that story becomes a bit personal in that in the pandemic hitting in Manhattan, working with really dealing with the fact that we were isolated and had an infant and couldn't really leave my apartment building, made the decision to leave Manhattan to go back to Silicon Valley, which is where my parents were living, and my dad was working at Apple. And so all of our family kind of came together. And what's really interesting about my family is entrepreneurship, I think, is kind of like a seed that was planted very young. And so both of my siblings run businesses. My mom runs a business. My dad was working at Apple, leading a special project there in energy storage. And so we were running a table that we would call iJazz Incubator, which was our dining room table, where we would all sit and we would be running our businesses. And so during that time, my dad, Majib iJazz, who is the founder and CEO of Our Next Energy, he came up with the idea to found an all-American battery company. And the work that I did in Guatemala previously had led to a hospital being built, something that he and I actually collaborated quite a bit on doing. His first time in Michigan was in a solar car, and my motivation to really join the solar car was based on his experience. And we kind of watched him make this huge leap of faith to leave an incredible role at Apple, doing some really exciting work, to start this company. And he started this company focused on values. And those values, to me, resonated the opportunity for impact. Starting being a part of one kind of on the ground floor, in that I was literally there on the day he resigned, and then there on the day that we incorporated. My brother actually, all of us went to Michigan. My brother designed the logo, which hasn't been touched since it was designed. And it was a little bit of a family affair in the support. Like, okay, we're gonna do this. We're gonna start this, and then we're gonna relocate back to Michigan. And so we relocated, and my daughter's getting a little bit older, and I'm towards the end of my PhD. And there came a time point where I had actually moved back to Canada. My husband is Canadian. And I was visiting with my family, with my, now she was at 1 year old at the time. And I realized that what my dad, Majib, was working on now was at the inflection point of lifting from a PowerPoint and from Zoom calls and from the earliest CAD designs of a product to an actual business. So there's 12 people, and I started to pose some questions because of my experience with Ivy and business operations from the grounds up. I was like, do we have human resources? Do we have infrastructure for the company? How are we treating, building company culture? If we're thinking about impact, how are we going to memorialize impact? How are we going to treat people really well who come to the company? And one of my first things as a new mom was, how are we going to have great family leave policies? How are we going to make this company a place that people want to work in order to innovate and to drive solutions, and then ultimately to have impact? And really, this experience, and I joined at that time point. Once I started to ask all those questions, he was like, do you want to solve all these questions? So my first role was in program management. I unofficially wore the hat of human resources for a good component of the first phase of the business, helped grow the team. We are now a 200 full-time employee company. We have 5 centers across the US. So we grew from an 18,000 square foot engineering facility to over almost 900,000 square feet of space, inclusive of the factory that Eric mentioned, which we just announced last week. And then we had to raise a lot of money. And in experiencing the diligence process for the first time, I was like, this is a little bit like research. It's a bit like doing chapter writing in a dissertation, where you're trying to provide evidence, strong evidence for people to give you millions of dollars to make impact and have transformation. So now, the triad here, and the last point that I'll make here before talking about what one is in a little bit more detail, is that this experience has solidified to me that this intersection of research, policy, and practice is so important for the ability for entrepreneurs or just people to be open-minded and to be able to be thinking from a systems perspective on how impact can be lifted and momentum can be built by using all three sides or points of this triangle. And so here we use research in all of our engineering work and our chemistry and cell development work and our workforce development strategies. We use research in our carbon accounting methodologies. We're using policy because we're living in landmark federal and state legislation for climate action, and we're benefiting so much from all of that funding. And then we're using practice and building this business and building a company and a culture that makes people, feel excited to come to work every day. So there we go. So, I really remained focused on impact, I think, throughout my career, and the ability to join one with such clarity to say, this is an opportunity for impact is really also rooted in Mujib's, his values and his core values. And my grandparents were professors at Virginia Tech, so Mujib's parents. My grandmother was a solar physicist. My grandfather was a nuclear physicist. And they talked about the democratization of energy at the dinner table and the opportunities for impacting the world by solving these problems and onboarding more renewable energy, way back before renewable energy was at the forefront or the focus of people's minds. And so his values have really guided the company, and I think solidified our culture and helped us maintain this momentum. And we're really focused on doubling the range of EVs, which that value actually trickles down to we're focused on the human experience. We are human-centered in our design approach. We're always trying to think about the user experience, even though we're building a component of a vehicle or a component of stationary storage. We think that in order to move the market, you have to give people solutions that are at parity what's out there, that are cost effective. The burden of change and adoption being placed too heavily on consumers has been the laggard in the industry. And so we solved this problem through a dual chemistry approach that was basically slide number one of the founding of One, was this idea that two parts of a battery could work together, much like a hybrid vehicle, in order to extend the range of a vehicle. And so we're going to be demonstrating 600 miles of range within a BMW iX platform in early 2023, which we're really excited about. And that's really using this dual chemistry architecture that we call Gemini. What's cool about Gemini and this doubling of range value and the human-centered design approach is that we also wanted to solve from a technology perspective while holding true our priorities of safety for consumers, so mitigating thermal runaway, which from a battery chemistry perspective means avoiding nickel cobalt chemistries in particular. I was excited about the prospect of doing that because of the human impacts of the supply chains of nickel and cobalt and the human rights violations and child labor abuses that occur in the DRC, where cobalt is largely mined. And so that safety value also speaks to the safety of the consumer, but the safety of people and the all the way upstream supply chain, and being very thoughtful about what's going into the products that we're making. And then, we've been focused on the development of this North American supply chain. And that's really from a sustainability perspective, which is some of the most exciting work that I get to work on, is thinking about our carbon accounting opportunities and our ability to define the reduction in embodied emissions in our products, and really driving meaningfully in a measurable way towards a zero emissions profile from an embodied emissions perspective. And a North American supply chain starts to enable that, and it, you reduce the emissions from transporting and logistics of literally lots of dirt all over the world for refinement. We're also prioritizing cleaner energy approaches to refining materials. And finally, we're prioritizing more sustainable materials, so iron and manganese over nickel and cobalt, and that abundance component and the opportunity for circularity with those materials is another way in which I'm really excited about impact at One. And so really at One, we're working to become the American battery company. We are the largest wholly American-owned gigafactory announcement for lithium iron phosphate chemistries in the US to date. We have grown a strong book of business. We've raised over $420 million from state funding and then equity financing. We are in a development program with BMW and working to win their business on the dual chemistry battery as well as a single chemistry approach as our first production program. And we're also working to really service the mobility and stationary energy storage needs because we live in this landmark legislation right now, which in my role is in leading strategy, policy, and sustainability. I've gotten to participate in all of the commenting and then work with the Department of Energy around the ability to onshore manufacturing. And that's the other really exciting part about what we're trying to do here at One, is we're trying to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And we talk about the green industrial revolution and the ability to demonstrate from an impact perspective that the factory that we're going to put in Van Buren Township that we'll start production in at the end of 2024, that is not going to be a pollutant for the community, that we are a closed loop system, and that in that factory and bringing manufacturing back to the United States, back to Michigan, we're going to put equity as a cornerstone for our workforce development approach and prioritize wraparound services to make sure that people are happy to work at One, and that we kind of paradigm shift what it means to make things, and that we demonstrate the upsides in career trajectories that can be found in clean tech manufacturing, because we are in a generational problem that we need to solve. And I really look at my now almost 3-year-old as a source of inspiration, because there is not a lot of time that we have to work towards decarbonization. We have many industries to tackle, very challenging problems to solve. We were very lucky to have Breakthrough Energy Ventures as our Series A lead, so that's Bill Gates' Climate Impact Fund, and the technologies that he's incubating in that fund are so phenomenal in terms of all of the ways and breadth of opportunities there are to decarbonize the multitude of systems that we have. And so at One, I'm really excited about the prospect for impact, but I'm also very much excited about the piece of the puzzle that we can play here in Michigan in growing our manufacturing capacity and becoming the American battery company. So thanks so much for listening today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Deeana. So many aspects of that I'd love to chat with you about. One of the first, the last part, in closing.
Oh, in closing. Can I do that really
Yeah,
quickly?
absolutely.
Yeah, okay, so I think that career paths are so stifling. And so the idea that you can explore your interests always, and even I think the unconventional interests that are not related to your career, embracing that is so important, because I've literally taken what I've learned administering a school breakfast program in an elementary school and applied it to raising hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you never know when those skills can help you cross-pollinate, and you also never know how those experiences help you diversify your thinking and maybe think outside of the box from standard approaches. And I think also catalyzing growth requires those risks, requires stepping into things that are a little bit unknown. I was telling you right before that when I started at One, I was kind of pretty middle of the barrel in terms of my role, and I was really nervous a lot of the time, even though I was almost done with my 5th degree, that I didn't have the skills to be in the battery industry. And it was realizing and recognizing that the content can be learned, but the skills and the approach and like the mindset can be applied, that was really freeing. So I think it's like embracing the risk-taking and then also stepping into the uncomfortable. And then the last is that there is a magic, I think, at the intersection of policy, practice, and research. And I've had a lot of opportunities to come back to the university over the last several months, which has been awesome. And I think about what you're working on here and then intersections and being able to lift research and mobilize research. Industry doesn't know how to mobilize research. That's one of my greatest edges at the company, is coming from like a heavy writing research background. From a technology perspective, industry is capable, but there's nuances in research that are out there that can be employed and be pointed to as evidence for how we should actually prioritize equity, for example. In onboarding, we're going to bring over 2,000 jobs to that factory by 2027. And research tells us that we can actually invest in childcare, and we can invest in mobility solutions so that there is an equity component to how we bring that workforce in, and that it can be baked into the business case, because the research says that it is good for retention, and it is good for upward mobility, and it is just all around good for a company. And so that mobilization, I think, of research, bringing it into practice, trying to see the intersections in policy. Policy has had so much to do with the momentum that we've had, and the exact moment in time that we find ourselves in with the infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. Billions and billions of dollars have been released for work like this. So I think that there's magic there, and I would encourage stepping into each space at some point in your life and start thinking about how your specific interests could be advanced by bringing the three together.
That's awesome. Yeah, the magic absolutely is present there. Show of hands, how many students, because I know there's a lot of engineering and comp sci students, as we learned earlier in here, how many of y'all want to go into the electric vehicle industry or energy storage industry? Okay, a couple of you. Speaking to these students, if you had to give them, hey, go get one skill set, go study something outside of your traditional engineering or comp sci major, what would that thing be?
It's a really good question. I never formally attended any business education, but I think this class is a great example. Like I think the exposure to understanding the diversity of experiences that others have had, I think it can be very encouraging, because like no card in bio undergrad at Michigan said that I was going to be in this role that I'm in today. I would say that, definitely trying to do some sort of intersection in business. I think strategy is like a really valuable skill that is housed a lot of the times in business class settings, but getting exposure to strategy work, I think, is really, really helpful, because it allows you to think and be a problem solver, and you can apply that in this industry. This industry has so many problems that we have to overcome in order to bring it to bear. It is like a magnitude of lift that has to happen. Every like component of the things that we're doing at One, but all these companies are doing right now. So we do need interdisciplinary, outside of the box thinkers, I think, to bring their engineering skill sets in, but then also having that like interdisciplinary perspective, I think, often helps us, think differently.
Sure. I noticed on your website, you guys are hiring like crazy for internships. Wink, 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 all y'all. When they're going to...
We had 27 interns this summer.
27.
And we had only about 100 people in the summer. So like we have a lot of internships.
There you go, which means potential opportunity post-internship as well. When they're thinking of applying for that internship at One or a company that's in a similar stage of growth, What are you looking for in that hiring process? What are you looking for in that interview? What are you looking for in the conversation with them that is going to make them stand out?
That's a great question. I'm really glad that you asked that question, because this is another thing that I've focused on in my career a lot, in always trying to get into the next thing that maybe I didn't have a place in, like starting a business without any experience. I was always focused on the initiative that I could take in order to demonstrate to the people that I was talking to that I could have impact. So I think it's an initiative. Like, I think the learning and understanding of the industry, of like even our company. I'm always most impressed when I meet with people who have a nuanced perspective, who spent more than maybe 10, 20 minutes understanding what we're doing. And so I think like preparation and initiative can go a long way. I also am very much a case study person. So I think like, initiative on those types of exercises are so important.
Sure. So the initiative and seeking out maybe where that niche opportunity for them to present value, of course, in that conversation reminds me of a recent speaker we had, a venture capitalist who came back and talked to us, and he was speaking about how every conversation is a negotiation. And every conversation is a negotiation.
Everything is chess.
Everything's chess, right? So 2-3 steps ahead. You had a hell of a series of negotiations, I would imagine, to get $200 million in state funding to land a plant in Southeast Michigan. When you think back to the interdisciplinary work that you've done in that triangle, what were the core skill sets that make you a good negotiator? What can they be studying to become good negotiators as well?
Ooh, core skill
What
sets.
Maybe not with studying. What can they practice? What can they learn?
Well, I'll tell you maybe what I think worked really well. So this funding is really, really competitive, and we bootstrap kind of in our internal team, went after seeking that $200 million. Our senior director of policy and sustainability was actually my colleague at Columbia, so we were doing our PhDs together. She's brilliant. Her name's Laura, and so kind of brought our creative director to the table, which is her husband first, because he's pretty smart, and then I brought her to the table because I was like, hey, we have a lot of complicated work to do. So I think like writing is like maybe a very, very core skill, like the negotiation component, being able to say what you want to say, but then back it up with evidence and writing. That is absolutely a huge reason why we were able to land the funding. We had to go through, an MSF board approval. There was a little bit of an uphill battle, lots of nuanced questions to answer. So that, and then the other thing is it's truly the interdisciplinary component, and maybe encouraging everybody to have some sort of like social or human-centered coursework. And right now, equity is being prioritized in state and federal funding. And so given just my background and Laura's background, we've been maybe uniquely able to define our prospective impacts on people. And with this type of funding, people actually, or the government wants to understand how you're going to have an economic impact on the lives of people. Like, that's what matters the most. And so we were able to bring a lot of that in to our negotiations and conversations. But, very much like chess, lots of moves.
Sure. One of the things I hear you touching on there, too, is tapping your network and being able to leverage those around you who might have areas of expertise that you don't, to help you understand how to find that niche area of opportunity and kind of strategy for the negotiations that you have. As part of that, to your point about values, and with students, or with the state now prioritizing equity as part of a value when it gives out the funding, you guys prioritized value when you decided to onshore manufacturing. Like, yes, COVID, and so there's the effect of having things close and non-susceptible to disruption. But then also, I've read extensively about how one is prioritizing onshore manufacturing so that you can reduce the end life cycle emissions of the product that you're using. How do you calculate incorporating a value of something, a decision of that size, into your company's plan and growth? How do you measure that opportunity cost?
What's really interesting is it's a little bit like the wild, wild west right now. So there's a lot of opportunity to define how we will value, because the market, I think, is being creative right now. But the how do you calculate it point, I think is something the whole industry is being pushed by, because the data that we currently use, like largely to calculate emissions and embodied emissions, is pretty poor. So the researcher in me went all the way back down to source data sets for a lot of the studies that talk about, you know, emissions of batteries versus combustion engine vehicles, and it's not very precise. And so we're taking a measured approach, and we are working with measured data sets. So that's, I think, number one is you do have to take a measured approach. Number two is we are in a landmark, you know, going back to the triad, policy, practice, research intersection on like how are we monetizing and dealing with carbon. And there are markets, of course, but what we're kind of looking at are there opportunities at a consumer level to be able to demonstrate, you know, the actual value for the reduced emissions for someone driving this vehicle over another vehicle. And those are really exciting new business opportunities. And so that's maybe my other plug for this industry right now, is that there is a multitude of new business models that have to be put into place in order to actually fully transition. You know, a battery at the end of an automotive life cycle is 80% degraded from start of life, you know, capacity. There's still an opportunity to move that into another market and another use case. This is something the whole ecosystem is talking a lot about right now, but one is getting to sit at the center of like actually research policy and practice right now, in that policy is being designed to figure out how do we actually do that, like move a car battery into a stationary application.
Stationary meaning energy
storage, like
right.
the grid, you know, home, like, you know, there's lots of ideas. And that's another carbon savings opportunity, because we're extending the life of an asset. And so then we also are thinking about, okay, how do we bake that into the business case? And that's maybe like a revenue opportunity at the simplest state, because you can just sell it again. But you know, there's other ways, I think, to be monetizing decarbonization and baking like the actual decarbonization and a measured approach to that into a business case. And I actually think that that's going to be another source of momentum behind the industry.
Sounds like source of opportunity.
It's a huge source
for
of
companies
opportunity.
to be founded as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to that first cycle, that first stage of providing it to the automotive industry, you guys have booked out $5 billion in business over the next 5 years. How do you begin to eat an elephant? How do you begin to look at that and have that much pre-order work to do? What are the biggest threats to that being accomplished and being fulfilled?
Yeah, you know, that it's really funny because next week we're going through a whole exercise with like the leadership team around product planning, because product planning, I think, is a core component to that. So for the book business that we currently have is for our first product. We'll start production in the first quarter of 2023. We're using an imported cell from Asia, and we're integrating a pack product. So that first product, more or less, is the same product for the 7 customers that we have signed for that, you know, $5 billion of book business, with variations sometimes on software and mounting hardware. So we're really focused on execution. So for the first product in particular, another huge value of our source of momentum for one in the market was that Majib's approach was, I want to invent this dual chemistry Gemini architecture. It's going to take a couple of years. It's going to start now. We did cell, power electronics, the pack architecture. But then I'm also going to make LFP competitive to NMC or nickel cobalt chemistries right now and make a product that can go to market fast. And that revenue generation, the revenue we'll generate in 2023, is where we've been able to raise the amount of money, secure the government funding. You know, they need to see revenue. They need to see booked business.
That's your beachhead?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So yeah, we're working to mitigate risks through being really focused on the first execution of manufacturing. We're working with a contract manufacturer, and it's significantly less complicated and expensive to manufacture packs than cells. So we put something like $10 million into that manufacturing line. We will invest $1.6 billion into the factory for cell manufacturing. And so now our next stage of like, how do we actually manage that prospective business and then execute properly is on the horizon, and we've got a lot of good experience at the table of people who have done it before, and so that's really helpful. But there is a lot to do, and winning a production program with an OEM is, I always am comparing things to my dissertation. I'm like, it's actually maybe as complicated as a dissertation or more in terms of the level of detail and precision and diligence that they want a company to be able to present in order to be sourced. And so our first market was the commercial truck market, people who are doing integrations, some, even aftermarket and conversions. This validation process, the customers we're dealing with are smaller. It wasn't, BMW and the other big OEMs that we're currently talking to right now, but the settings that we're in and the conversations we're in right now, they require a lift up, and that's like the scaling of the business. Like, we're at 200 heads, and now we're planning how do we get to 300 heads to actually be able to deliver production programs to OEMs.
Well, last kind of point there, I can't imagine you get there without being the disruptive industry force that one has become and having the disruptive workforce that you were so critical to hiring in the early part. So thank you for coming here today and give us a bit of a peek inside. Appreciate
Awesome.
it.
Thank
Thanks,
you
everybody.
so much.